What makes a radar technician with almost no combat training hold off enemy soldiers with just an M16, while calling in airstrikes and directing rescue helicopters? How does a Chief Master Sergeant manning a secret base on a mountaintop in Laos save 3 wounded comrades while enemy fire rains down from above? Why would the United States government tell a man's family he died in a helicopter accident when he actually died a hero? And what kind of mission is so classified that it takes 42 years for the truth to come out? 42 years before a widow and 3 sons learn how their husband and father really died. You're about to hear the story of Chief Master Sergeant Richard L. Etchberger and Lima Site 85, the most secret radar installation of the Vietnam War, the site of the largest single-day ground combat loss for the Air Force, and a mission so classified that the men who fought there were officially declared civilians. This is the story of a radar superintendent who became a one-man army on a mountaintop in neutral Laos, and how American industrial might and one man's courage collided in 6 hours of hell. Let's begin. March 10th, 1968. 2100 hours. Phu Pha Thi Mountain, northeastern Laos, 15 miles from the North Vietnamese border. Chief Master Sergeant Richard L. Etchberger stood at the edge of Lima Site 85's rough encampment, 5,600 feet above the jungle canopy, watching the darkness gather over the valleys below. The 35-year-old radar superintendent from Hamburg, Pennsylvania, was officially a civilian employee of Lockheed Aircraft Services. His Air Force uniform was locked away, his rank insignia removed. His very presence in the Kingdom of Laos was a violation of the 1962 International Agreement on the Neutrality of Laos, signed by 14 nations and promising that no foreign military forces would operate on Laotian soil. What Etchberger and his 15 fellow technicians were doing on this mountaintop was more than classified. It was illegal, it was essential, and by dawn tomorrow, most of them would be dead. The radar equipment they maintained, the massive TSQ-81 system with its line-of-sight beam capable of guiding bombers to precise coordinates through monsoon clouds and darkness, had directed 27% of all American airstrikes into North Vietnam and Laos since November 1967. Over 500 bombing missions, each one made possible by the technical wizardry, happening on this remote mountain peak. The North Vietnamese knew the radar site existed. They knew it was making their anti-aircraft defenses useless. They knew that American B-52s were hitting targets with unprecedented accuracy, despite weather that should have made bombing impossible, and they were coming to destroy it. What none of the Americans on Lima Site 85 knew as darkness fell on March 10th was that North Vietnamese sappers had been training for months specifically to climb the supposedly unscalable western cliffs, that a battalion-strength assault force was already positioning in the valleys below, that in less than 6 hours the mountain would erupt in artillery fire, mortar explosions, and close-quarters combat, and that the radar technician from Pennsylvania, a man with minimal weapons training whose job was maintaining electronic equipment, would become the only thing standing between total annihilation and the survival of any Americans at all. Richard Loy Etchberger was born on March 5, 1933, in Hamburg, Pennsylvania, a small town in Berks County. He graduated from Hamburg High School in 1951 and enlisted in the Air Force on August 31st of that year, at age 18. This wasn't the profile of a warrior. Etchberger was a technician, a specialist in radar systems and electronic equipment. His expertise was in maintenance, calibration, and operation of the complex systems that made modern air warfare possible. By 1967, after 16 years of service, he had been promoted to Chief Master Sergeant, the highest enlisted rank in the Air Force. He was a crew chief, a supervisor, a man who understood how electrons moved through circuits and how radar pulses bounced off targets hundreds of miles away. He had never been trained as an infantryman, had never attended combat leadership schools, had never expected to fight hand-to-hand against enemy soldiers. But on April 1st, 1967, when he pinned on his Chief Master Sergeant stripes, he had no idea where those stripes would lead him. The mission that would define Etchberger's life and death began with weather and geography. The northeast monsoon season over North Vietnam, lasting from October through April, brought heavy cloud cover that made visual bombing nearly impossible. For weeks at a time, American aircraft couldn't see their targets. Radar bombing was possible but inaccurate, with errors measured in hundreds of yards. This was unacceptable for striking targets near populated areas or hitting the critical infrastructure along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The solution was a system called Combat Sky Spot, adapted from Strategic Air Command's peacetime procedures for evaluating bomber crews. The concept was elegant. A ground-based radar with line of sight to the target area could track both the bomber and the target simultaneously. Precise calculations could determine the exact moment to release ordnance, regardless of weather or visibility. The system could guide aircraft to within yards of intended impact points. The problem was geography. To have line of sight into North Vietnam, particularly the critical areas around Hanoi and the supply routes through the mountains, the radar needed to be positioned on high ground close to the border, and the only high ground close enough was in Laos, a nation that had officially declared neutrality and where American military forces were explicitly forbidden. The CIA found the solution on Po Pha Thi, a karst limestone mountain rising 600 feet above the jungle in northeastern Laos, just 15 miles from North Vietnam. The peak was relatively flat, suitable for helicopter operations and equipment installation. 3 sides dropped nearly vertically to the valleys below, creating natural defences that seemed impregnable. The 4th side, the eastern slope, was less steep but could be defended by local forces. The location was perfect. The legality was impossible, so they created a legal fiction. In late 1966, the CIA began constructing facilities on Pho Pha Thi under the codename Heavy Green. An airstrip was built by Air America, the CIA's proprietary airline. Defensive positions were established and manned by Hmong guerrillas and Thai mercenaries, irregular forces that could provide plausible deniability for American involvement. Then came the most elaborate deception. The Air Force personnel selected to operate the radar would be sheep-dipped, temporarily released from military service and hired as civilian employees of Lockheed Aircraft Services. They would wear civilian clothes, carry no military identification, use no rank insignia. If captured or killed, the US government could claim they were civilian contractors operating independently. Chief Master Sergeant Richard Etchberger was selected for Lima Site 85 in October 1967. He was told the mission was classified at the highest levels, that he would be operating in denied territory, that his presence would be illegal under international law, that if anything went wrong, the US government would deny his existence. He was given a choice. He chose to go. The sheep-dipping process was conducted in Washington, D.C., where Etchberger and the other selectees were officially released from the Air Force and hired by Lockheed. His wife, Catherine, travelled with him to the capital, knowing only that her husband was volunteering for a dangerous classified mission. She was sworn to secrecy about even this vague knowledge. Their 3 sons, Corey, Steve, and Richard Jr., were told nothing. In November 1967, Chief Master Sergeant Etchberger, now officially civilian electronics technician Richard Etchberger, boarded a helicopter at Udon Royal Thai Air Force Base and flew into Laos. He would never return. Lima Site 85 was primitive even by wartime standards. The radar equipment occupied hardened positions blasted into the rock. Living quarters were rough wooden structures. Water was scarce. Resupply came only by helicopter, weather permitting. The site was staffed by 19 Americans, 16 former Air Force technicians including Etchberger, 2 CIA case officers named Howard Freeman and John Spence, and 1 forward air controller. Additional security was provided by approximately 1,000 Hmong fighters under CIA direction, positioned on the lower slopes and in the valleys. The radar itself was a marvel of engineering transported in pieces by helicopter and assembled on the mountain. The TSQ-81 system could track aircraft up to 200 miles away and guide them to release points with accuracy measured in yards. Through the monsoon season of 1967-68, this single installation made possible what should have been impossible: precision bombing through clouds so thick that pilots never saw their targets. The results were immediate and devastating to North Vietnamese operations. Convoys on the Ho Chi Minh Trail that had moved safely under cloud cover were destroyed. Supply depots hidden by weather were obliterated. The psychological impact was enormous. The North Vietnamese realized that weather no longer protected them, that American bombs could find them anywhere, any time. They began searching for the radar site. On January 12, 1968, they found it. At approximately 1300 hours, 2 Russian-built Antonov An-2 biplanes appeared over Pho Pha Thi. These slow, fabric-covered aircraft looked like they belonged in a World War I museum. They had been converted into improvised bombers, dropping 120-meter mortar rounds through tubes in the floor. The bombs were crude, converted mortar shells that armed in the slipstream and detonated on impact. But they were effective. The biplanes made 3 passes over Lima Site 85, dropping their ordnance on the Hmong positions and the radar site. Several Hmong fighters were killed. The radar equipment was not damaged. As the biplanes circled for another pass, a CIA Air America UH-1B Huey helicopter, piloted by Ted Moore and carrying ammunition resupply for the site, spotted them. Moore's crew chief, Glenn Woods, grabbed an AK-47 and leaned out the open door. At close range, Woods opened fire on one of the slow-moving biplanes. The burst hit the aircraft's engine. The An-2 began trailing smoke, losing altitude, and crashed in the jungle below. It was possibly the only time in history that a helicopter shot down a fixed-wing aircraft with small arms fire. The second biplane escaped, but the message was clear. The North Vietnamese knew exactly where Lima Site 85 was located. They knew what it was doing, and they were coming to destroy it. The US ambassador to Laos, William H. Sullivan, who controlled all American operations in the country under the country team concept, received urgent warnings. The radar site was vulnerable. The small American contingent could not defend against a determined ground assault. Evacuation and destruction of the equipment should begin immediately. But the northeast monsoon was at its peak. The radar was directing bombing missions that were having significant impact on North Vietnamese logistics. Higher authority ordered Lima Site 85 to continue operations. The equipment was too valuable, the mission too important. Plans were made to reinforce the site's defences, but the 1962 Geneva Accords prohibited American ground combat forces in Laos. The irregular Hmong and Thai forces would have to suffice. Ambassador Sullivan, after considerable debate, authorized the limited distribution of M16 rifles to the Air Force technicians. The radar operators and maintenance specialists received a brief familiarization with the weapons, how to load, how to fire, how to clear jams, nothing approaching actual combat training. These were men who worked with oscilloscopes and circuit diagrams, not rifles and grenades. For 2 months, Lima Site 85 continued operations under increasing pressure. North Vietnamese artillery regularly shelled the mountain. Hmong scouts reported enemy reconnaissance patrols probing the defences. Intelligence indicated that a major assault was being planned. On March 10th, 1968, the assault began. At 1800 hours, North Vietnamese artillery opened up on Pho Pha Thi. Mortars, rockets, and artillery shells rained down on the mountain. The barrage was the heaviest yet experienced, a coordinated fire mission designed to suppress the defenders and cover the final approach of the assault force. The Americans and their Hmong allies took cover as explosions walked across the mountain peak. The radar continued operating through the bombardment, guiding strike aircraft into North Vietnam even as the site itself came under attack. What the defenders didn't know was that while the artillery fire focused their attention on the eastern approaches where previous probes had come, North Vietnamese sappers were already climbing the western cliffs. The supposedly unscalable precipice, the natural defence that made Pho Pha Thi seem invulnerable, was being conquered by enemy soldiers who had spent months training specifically for this assault. Using ropes, climbing equipment, and techniques perfected on similar terrain, the North Vietnamese troops scaled the sheer rock face in darkness. It was a feat of mountaineering that American commanders had declared impossible. At approximately 0300 hours on March 11th, the sappers reached the summit. The first indication that something was catastrophically wrong came when grenades began exploding among the American positions. The enemy wasn't coming up the defended eastern slope. They were already on top of the mountain, having appeared from the direction no one was watching. The assault was swift and brutal. The North Vietnamese sappers, fresh from their climb and pumped with adrenaline, moved through the American positions, throwing grenades and firing automatic weapons at point-blank range. 3 American technicians were killed instantly in the opening moments. Captain Eugene Blanchfield, the site commander, Chief Master Sergeant Charles Sloan, Technical Sergeant William Husband, dead before they could react to an enemy that shouldn't have been able to reach them. The surviving Americans scattered, seeking whatever cover they could find in the rock outcroppings and crevices that dotted the mountaintop. The radar position was overrun. The living quarters were on fire. The carefully maintained electronic equipment that had guided hundreds of bombing missions was being destroyed by grenades and automatic weapons fire. In the chaos and darkness, with explosions and muzzle flashes. Lighting the scene in stroboscopic horror, the Americans tried to survive. Chief Master Sergeant Richard Etchberger, the radar superintendent from Pennsylvania, found himself with 7 other survivors on a small ledge just below the western edge of the mountaintop. Captain Stanley Sliz, shot twice. Staff Sergeant John Daniel, wounded in both legs. Sergeant Jack Starling, wounded and playing dead near the Takan equipment. Staff Sergeant Bill Husband, unhurt but separated from the main group. Sergeant Roger Huffman, the combat air controller near the destroyed helipad. And the 2 CIA officers, Freeman and Spence, at the southern end of the position. 8 men. The only American survivors out of 19. And the North Vietnamese were hunting them. The ledge where Etchberger and several others had taken refuge was precarious, a narrow shelf of rock overlooking a nearly vertical drop to the valley, 5,000 feet below. Above them, North Vietnamese soldiers controlled the mountain peak. Grenades periodically arced over the edge, exploding on the ledge or bouncing off into space. Small arms fire raked the position whenever anyone moved. It should have been the end. The enemy held the high ground. The Americans were trapped against a cliff face. Rescue was impossible in darkness with enemy forces controlling the landing zones. Standard doctrine said to wait for dawn and hope for the best. Richard Etchberger decided that waiting meant dying. The radar technician, the man whose combat training consisted of a brief familiarization with the M16 rifle, took action that would save the lives of every American who survived Lima Site 85. He had his M16, he had ammunition, he had an emergency radio, and he had a decision to make. Etchberger positioned himself at the edge of the ledge where he could see the approaches from above. Every time North Vietnamese soldiers appeared or tried to work their way down to the American position, Etchberger fired. He didn't have formal training in combat marksmanship, didn't know the approved firing positions or engagement techniques taught at infantry schools. He simply pointed his rifle and pulled the trigger, using the fundamentals he'd learned during his brief familiarization. But fundamentals were enough. The M16's 556-meter rounds, fired at the close ranges dictated by the terrain, were devastating. Enemy soldiers attempting to reach the ledge were driven back or killed. The North Vietnamese, expecting to finish off trapped Americans, instead found themselves facing sustained, accurate fire from a defender who refused to be suppressed. While maintaining his defensive position, Etchberger was simultaneously doing something even more critical. He was working the emergency radio. The tactical radios at Lima Site 85 had been destroyed or were in enemy hands. But Etchberger had grabbed a survival radio, a small emergency transceiver designed for downed air crews. Its range was limited, its power weak, but it was enough. At Thruster 30 hours, Etchberger established contact with Nail 59, a forward air controller orbiting 30 miles away. His transmission was brief and professional, a radar technician reporting a tactical situation like he was describing equipment status. This is Heavy Green, site overrun, multiple friendlies KIA, survivors on Westcliff, need immediate air support and extraction, enemy on high ground, will mark position. For the next 3 hours, as darkness slowly gave way to dawn, Richard Etchberger fought a two-handed battle that defied everything anyone thought possible from a radar maintenance specialist. With his right hand, he fired his M16, keeping enemy soldiers away from the ledge where his wounded comrades lay helpless. With his left hand, he operated the radio, directing attack aircraft that began arriving as word of the disaster spread through the American air net. The first aircraft to respond were 2 A-1 Sky Raiders from Nakhon Phanom Air Base in Thailand, propeller-driven attack aircraft that could loiter for hours and carry enormous ordnance loads. Using Etchberger's radio transmissions to locate the American position, the Sky Raiders began making strafing runs across the mountaintop, their 20mm cannons and 7.62mm machine guns suppressing enemy fire. Etchberger, with no training as a forward air controller, talked the pilots onto target. Friendlies are on the west side ledge. Enemy positions are above us on the peak. You're clear to engage north of our position. The A-1s made multiple passes, their ordnance impacting so close to the American position that shrapnel and rock fragments showered the ledge. But the enemy fire slackened. On their next pass, the Sky Raiders dropped cluster bombs on the North Vietnamese positions. The CBU canisters tumbled through the air, split open, and released hundreds of baseball-sized bomblets across the mountain peak. The explosions cleared the immediate area, giving the Americans a brief respite. That respite was all Etchberger needed to organise the rescue. At approximately 0700 hours, as dawn broke over the mountains, 2 Air America helicopters approached Pho Pha Thi. These were UH-1H Hueys flown by CIA contract pilots, men who specialised in flying into impossible situations to extract personnel from denied territory. The pilots, whose names remain classified in CIA files, were told the situation was desperate. Americans trapped on a cliff face, enemy forces controlling the mountain, no secure landing zone. They came anyway. The problem was immediately apparent. The ledge where the Americans were trapped couldn't accommodate a helicopter landing. The vertical cliff below prevented a hover close enough to pick up survivors directly. The only option was to use the jungle penetrator, a weighted device that could be lowered from a hovering helicopter. Survivors would be fitted into rescue slings attached to the penetrator, then hoisted up to the aircraft. It was a slow, vulnerable process that would require the helicopter to maintain a hover while enemy soldiers fired from above. Etchberger understood the math. 8 Americans. Jungle penetrator held 3 slings. Multiple lifts required. Someone would have to stay exposed on that ledge until last, maintaining defensive fire while his comrades were lifted to safety. The radar technician from Pennsylvania never considered any other option. The first Air America Huey approached the ledge, its turbine screaming as the pilot fought the treacherous mountain winds. Door gunners fired into suspected enemy positions as the aircraft swung into position above the trapped Americans. The jungle penetrator was lowered on its steel cable, swinging and spinning in the rotor wash. Etchberger left his firing position and scrambled across the ledge to where the most seriously wounded lay. Captain Stanley Sliz hit twice and barely, conscious. Staff Sergeant John Daniel, his legs shattered by bullets. Etchberger fitted them into the rescue slings with hands that had maintained delicate electronic equipment, securing the straps and checking that each man was properly fastened. While he worked, exposed and vulnerable, enemy fire began hitting the helicopter. Bullets sparked off the airframe. The pilots fought to maintain position as their aircraft shuddered from impacts. The door gunners returned fire, their M60 machine guns hammering away at muzzle flashes on the mountaintop. Etchberger waved off, signalling that the wounded were secure. The hoist motor engaged. Sliz and Daniel rose toward the hovering helicopter, spinning slowly on the cable, completely helpless. 30 seconds, 1 minute. The hoist brought them to the aircraft door where crew members pulled them inside. The helicopter broke away, gaining altitude and distance from the cliff face. The first lift was successful. But there were still 6 Americans on the ledge, and now the North Vietnamese knew exactly where they were and what was happening. The second helicopter approached. More door gunner fire, more bullets impacting the aircraft, more desperate moments of exposure as Etchberger secured another wounded man in the sling. Staff Sergeant Bill Husband, one of the few unhurt survivors, insisted on going up with the wounded to make room for those who needed it most. Etchberger fitted him into the sling alongside the other survivor. The hoist cycle repeated, spinning, rising, vulnerable. The helicopter pulled away with 2 more saved. 4 Americans still on the ledge. The tactical situation was deteriorating. The North Vietnamese were recovering from the airstrikes and massing for a final assault. Enemy soldiers were working their way down the cliff approaches, getting closer to the American position. The A-1 Sky Raiders had exhausted their ordnance and departed to rearm. Fresh air support was inbound, but hadn't yet arrived. Etchberger was alone with 3 wounded men, his M16 running low on ammunition and enemy forces closing from multiple directions. The third helicopter made its approach. Etchberger secured 2 more wounded in the slings. Sergeant Jack Starling, who had been playing dead near the Taycan until Etchberger found him and brought him to the ledge, and one of the CIA officers, the hoist cycle, the exposed climb, the desperate door gunner fire, 2 more saved. And now there were only 2 Americans left on that ledge in Laos, Richard Etchberger and 1 more survivor. The 4th and final helicopter approached. The enemy fire was intensifying. The North Vietnamese knew this was the last lift. They knew if they could down the helicopter or kill the men on the ledge, they could claim total victory. Machine gun fire walked across the cliff face. RPG trails streaked toward the aircraft. The door gunners were taking hits, but the pilots held position. Etchberger secured the last wounded survivor in the sling, fitted the straps, checked the connections, gave the thumbs up. The hoist motor engaged. The survivor began rising toward the helicopter, and Richard Etchberger was alone on a ledge in Laos, the last American at Lima Site 85, maintaining his defensive position while his final comrade was pulled to safety. When the survivor reached the helicopter, the crew members looked down at the ledge. Etchberger was still there, still firing at enemy positions, still doing his job. The jungle penetrator was lowered again, for himself this time. The radar technician from Pennsylvania left his firing position and moved to the sling. He had held that position for nearly 6 hours, had directed airstrikes, had maintained defensive fire against an enemy that held every advantage, had personally secured 7 wounded men in rescue slings while under direct fire, had saved every American survivor of the Lima Site 85 disaster. Now, finally, it was his turn. Etchberger secured himself in the sling, gave the signal, the hoist motor engaged. He began rising toward the helicopter, slowly spinning on the cable, leaving the ledge where he had made his stand. The rescuers could see him clearly, alive, unhurt, rising towards safety. They had done it. Everyone was out. Then one North Vietnamese soldier, somewhere on the mountain below, fired his AK-47 into the underside of the helicopter. The bullet, a 7.62 a 39mm round, fired from a weapon designed by Mikhail Kalashnikov in 1947, came up through the thin aluminum floor of the helicopter fuselage. It passed through the cabin space. It struck Chief Master Sergeant Richard L. Etchberger as he dangled from the hoist cable 50 feet below the aircraft. The wound was catastrophic. Etchberger, still in the rescue sling, was pulled into the helicopter. The crew members immediately began first aid. But the bullet had done its work. The helicopter turned southeast, racing toward the CIA base at Long Tieng, Laos, where medical facilities waited. In the back of the shaking aircraft, surrounded by the wounded men he had saved, Richard Etchberger died. The man who had held off an army, the radar technician who had become a warrior, the father of 3 who had volunteered for an illegal mission on a secret mountain. Gone in the last seconds of a successful rescue. He was 35 years old. Staff Sergeant John Daniel, the man with shattered legs whom Etchberger had fitted into the first sling, regained consciousness during the flight to Long Tieng. He learned that Etchberger had been hit. He couldn't believe it. Etchberger had been unhurt throughout the entire battle, had never taken a scratch despite hours of combat. How could he be dead? Daniel would later tell reporters, 42 years later when the truth finally came out, "Hell, he hasn't been injured, he hasn't been shot. How is he dead?" The answer was simple and terrible. Richard Etchberger had saved 7 men before thinking of himself, had maintained his position until every wounded comrade was secure, had climbed into the sling last as any good leader would, as any good man would, and in those final seconds, one lucky enemy shot had found him. The Battle of Lima Site 85 was over. 12 Americans were dead. The largest single-day ground combat loss for the Air Force in the entire Vietnam War. The radar site was destroyed, the equipment was wrecked, the mission was finished. But 7 Americans had survived because one radar technician refused to give up. The survivors were flown to Udon Air Base in Thailand. There they were debriefed by CIA officers and Air Force intelligence. There they were sworn to secrecy. There they were told that everything that had happened at Lima Site 85 was classified at the highest possible levels, that they would never be able to discuss it, that the men who died were officially civilian contractors, that the families would be told limited information. There they learned that Chief Master Sergeant Richard Etchberger was immediately being recommended for the Medal of Honor. His actions on March 11, 1968, met every criterion. Conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. Selfless devotion to duty. The recommendation was submitted through channels. It reached the desk of General John D. Ryan, Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, the approving authority for top awards. General Ryan read the nomination, read the supporting statements, read the accounts of Etchberger's actions. Then he rejected it. Not because Etchberger didn't deserve the Medal of Honor, everyone agreed he deserved it, but because Lima Site 85 was still classified, because American military personnel weren't supposed to be in Laos, because awarding the Medal of Honor would require public disclosure of the secret radar site, the sheep-dipped personnel, and the American ground combat operations in neutral Laos. The 1962 Geneva Accords were still in effect. The diplomatic situation was delicate. The legal situation was impossible. So instead of the Medal of Honor, Chief Master Sergeant Richard L. Etchberger was posthumously awarded the Air Force Cross, the second highest decoration for valor. The citation was classified. The ceremony was secret. On January 15, 1969, in a closed ceremony in the Pentagon, Air Force Chief of Staff General John P. McConnell presented the Air Force Cross to Catherine Etchberger, Richard's widow. Their 3 sons attended, Corey, Steve, and Richard Jr. The boys were told their father had been killed in a helicopter accident in Southeast Asia. Nothing about combat, nothing about the battle, nothing about holding off enemy soldiers or saving 7 men, just a helicopter accident. Catherine knew more. She knew Richard had been on a classified mission. She knew he had died a hero. But she was sworn to secrecy. Even her own children couldn't know the truth. For 18 years, the truth remained classified. For 18 years, Catherine kept her secret. For 18 years, the 3 Etchberger boys believed their father had died in an accident. In 1986, the Air Force declassified the Lima Site 85 mission. Documents about the radar site, about Heavy Green, about the battle on March 11, 1968, were released to the National Archives. Historians began writing about the secret air war in Laos. In 1998, author Timothy Castle published One Day Too Long, a detailed account of the Battle of Lima Site 85 based on declassified documents and interviews with survivors. The book revealed that the Air Force had suffered its largest single ground combat loss of the entire Vietnam War. That 12 men had died on a mountaintop in Laos that officially didn't exist. That one man, a radar technician with almost no combat training, had held off enemy forces for hours and saved 7 lives. The Etchberger sons read the book. They learned for the first time how their father really died. They learned about the combat, about the defense of the ledge, about the rescue, about the bullet that found him in the final seconds. They learned their father was a hero, not killed in an accident, killed in action, saving his men. In the early 2000s, veterans of the 1st Combat Evaluation Group, the Air Force unit that had provided personnel for Lima Site 85, began a campaign. The campaign to upgrade Richard Etchberger's Air Force Cross to the Medal of Honor. The mission was declassified. The truth was out. The diplomatic concerns were decades old. Why shouldn't Etchberger receive the recognition he deserved? They gathered statements from survivors, compiled documentation, built the case. In 2008, Secretary of the Air Force Michael B. Donnelly reviewed the evidence and approved the upgrade. The recommendation went to Congress. In 2009, Congress waived the normal time limitations for Medal of Honor awards and approved the upgrade. 42 years after Chief Master Sergeant Richard L. Etchberger died on a mountaintop in Laos, he would finally receive the nation's highest military decoration. On September 21, 2010, in the East Room of the White House, President Barack Obama presented the Medal of Honor to Etchberger's 3 sons. Corey, Steve, and Richard Jr., now men in their 40s, received the medal their father had earned 4 decades earlier. President Obama read the citation. Chief Master Sergeant Richard L. Etchberger distinguished himself by extraordinary heroism on March 11, 1968, in the country of Laos. While assigned as Ground Radar Superintendent, Detachment 1, 1043rd Radar Evaluation Squadron, on that day, Chief Etchberger and his team of technicians were manning a top-secret defensive position at Lima Site 85 when the base was overrun by an enemy ground force. Receiving sustained and withering heavy artillery attacks directly upon his unit's position, Chief Etchberger's entire crew lay dead or severely wounded. Despite having received little or no combat training, Chief Etchberger single-handedly held off the enemy with an M16, while simultaneously directing airstrikes into the area and calling for air rescue. Because of his fierce defense and heroic and selfless actions, he was able to deny the enemy access to his position and save the lives of his remaining crew. With the arrival of the rescue aircraft, Chief Etchberger, without hesitation, repeatedly and deliberately risked his own life, exposing himself to heavy enemy fire in order to place 3 surviving wounded comrades into rescue slings hanging from the hovering helicopter, waiting to airlift them to safety. With his remaining crew safely aboard, Chief Etchberger finally climbed into an evacuation sling himself, only to be fatally wounded by enemy ground fire as he was being raised into the aircraft. Chief Etchberger's bravery and determination in the face of persistent enemy fire and overwhelming odds are in keeping with the highest standards of performance and traditions of military service. Chief Etchberger's gallantry, self-sacrifice, and profound concern for his fellow men at risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty, reflect the highest credit upon himself and the United States Air Force. The three sons stood in the East Room surrounded by Air Force officers, survivors from Lima Site 85, and current Medal of Honor recipients. They held the medal their father had earned, the medal that had taken 42 years to receive, the medal that represented 6 hours on a ledge in Laos when a radar technician became a warrior. Staff Sergeant John Daniel, the survivor with shattered legs whom Etchberger had secured in the first rescue sling, was interviewed after the ceremony. He was asked about Etchberger's actions. Daniel, now an old man, looked at the reporter and said, "It should have happened 42 years plus ago, and he should have gotten a damn 55-gallon drum full of them if he wanted. That's how much he deserved it." The statistics of Lima Site 85 tell part of the story. Between November 1967 and March 1968, the radar site directed over 500 combat airstrikes into North Vietnam and Laos. 27% of all American airstrikes in the northern part of North Vietnam during those months were guided by Lima Site 85. The site made precision bombing possible through weather that should have grounded all operations. The psychological impact on North Vietnamese forces was enormous. They couldn't hide from American bombers anymore. Weather didn't protect them. Darkness didn't protect them. The radar on Pho Pha Thi found them anyway. The cost was 12 Americans killed in the battle, 12 more Air Force personnel who died in later operations related to Lima Site 85, hundreds of Hmong and Thai fighters killed defending the mountain, 9 Americans whose remains have never been recovered from Pho Pha Thi, still on that mountain in Laos more than 50 years later, and 1 chief, Master Sergeant from Pennsylvania, who did things that radar technicians aren't supposed to be able to do. But those statistics missed the real story. The real story is about what happens when an ordinary man faces an impossible situation and refuses to accept defeat. Richard Etchberger wasn't a special forces operator, wasn't a trained infantryman, wasn't a warrior by trade or temperament. He was a technician, a specialist in radar systems and electronic equipment, a supervisor who maintained complex machinery and trained younger airmen in proper procedures. He had enlisted to serve his country, not to fight in ground combat. He had risen through the ranks based on technical competence, not combat prowess. He had volunteered for Lima Site 85 knowing it was dangerous but expecting his role would be operating equipment, not engaging enemy soldiers. When the North Vietnamese sappers came over the edge of Pho Pha Thi in the early morning darkness of March 11, 1968, Richard Etchberger could have done what many men would have done. He could have hidden, tried to escape down the mountain in the darkness, surrendered and hoped for prisoner of war status, waited passively for rescue that might never come. Instead, a radar technician from Hamburg, Pennsylvania, decided that 7 wounded men were going to get off that mountain alive, that enemy soldiers were going to be held back, that air support was going to be directed onto target, that rescue helicopters were going to have someone guiding them in, that wounded comrades were going to be secured in rescue slings and lifted to safety, that every American who could be saved would be saved. And if that required a radar superintendent to become a one-man defensive position for 6 hours, then that's what would happen. The weapons he used were simple. 1 M16 rifle, 1 emergency radio, ammunition and determination. No heavy weapons, no support, no reinforcements. Just one man making the decision that he would stand between his wounded comrades and the enemy soldiers trying to kill them. The tactical situation should have been hopeless. The Americans were on a ledge with enemy forces above them holding the high ground. The North Vietnamese could maneuver, coordinate, bring up reinforcements. The Americans were fixed in position, unable to retreat, unable to advance. Classic military doctrine says the side with mobility and the high ground wins. Richard Etchberger rewrote the tactical calculus through sheer refusal to quit. Every time enemy soldiers tried to approach the ledge, he engaged them. Every time fire slackened, he worked the radio. Every time aircraft appeared, he talked them onto target despite having no training as a forward air controller. He directed A-1 Sky Raider strikes so close to his own position that shrapnel hit the ledge. He coordinated cluster bomb drops that detonated meters from American positions. He maintained defensive fire while simultaneously acting as air controller, medical, support for the wounded, and tactical commander for a position that wasn't supposed to still exist. For 6 hours, while dawn slowly broke over the mountains of Laos, one man kept 7 wounded Americans alive against an enemy force that had already killed 12 others. The rescue itself demonstrated the kind of courage that civilians rarely understand. When the Air America helicopters approached, Etchberger knew the procedure. Jungle penetrator, rescue slings, hoist cycle, 3 men per lift maximum, 8 Americans to evacuate. Math is simple, multiple lifts required. Someone has to stay exposed until everyone else is safe. The leader stays last. Etchberger never considered another option. He secured the wounded first, the most seriously injured, the men who couldn't function, then the ambulatory wounded, then the unhurt. Each time, while he worked to fit men into rescue slings, he was completely exposed, couldn't maintain defensive fire, couldn't take cover, just had to trust that the door gunners would suppress enemy fire enough that he could work. 4 times the helicopter came. 4 times Etchberger exposed himself to enemy fire to secure survivors in slings. 4 times the hoist lifted his comrades to safety while he stayed on the ledge. Only when every other American was secured did Richard Etchberger climb into the sling himself. The bullet that killed him in those final seconds was pure chance. 1 enemy soldier, 1 rifle, 1 shot among thousands fired that morning. It came through the helicopter floor and found him dangling below the aircraft. After 6 hours of combat without a scratch, he died in the last minute of the rescue. The survivors never forgot. For 42 years they carried the memory of what Etchberger had done. They told their families, they told other veterans, they wrote letters to commanders and congressmen. They built the case for the Medal of Honor that should have been awarded in 1968. When the medal was finally presented in 2010, every surviving witness from Lima Site 85 who could attend was present. They stood in the East Room of the White House, old men now, and watched 3 sons receive the medal their father had earned 4 decades earlier. And they knew that Richard Etchberger would have been embarrassed by the attention. He was doing his job, taking care of his people, making sure everyone got out. That's what leaders do, that's what good men do. The fact that it required extraordinary heroism under impossible conditions was just how things worked out. The legacy of Richard Etchberger extends beyond one battle on one mountain in Laos. Lima Site 85 was part of a larger pattern in the secret war in Southeast Asia. American forces operating in countries where they officially weren't supposed to be. Missions so classified that participants were sworn to secrecy for decades. Men dying in combat whose families were told they died in accidents. The sheep-dipping process, where military personnel were temporarily declared civilians to provide plausible deniability, was used throughout the region. Hundreds of American service members operated in denied territory under false pretenses and cover stories. If they were killed or captured, the government could deny their military status. The 1962 Geneva Accords on Laos had created a legal impossibility. The treaty declared Laos neutral and prohibited foreign military forces from operating there. But North Vietnam was using Laos as a sanctuary and supply route, moving troops and material through Laotian territory to attack South Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, which wound through Laos and Cambodia, was critical to North Vietnamese logistics. If the United States couldn't interdict the trail, the war in Vietnam was unwinnable. So American forces operated in Laos under legal fictions: CIA proprietary airlines, civilian contractors, irregular forces advised by men with no official status, and radar sites manned by technicians who officially didn't exist. The result was effective military action combined with diplomatic deniability. The radar at Lima Site 85 made precision bombing possible through weather and darkness. The bombing disrupted North Vietnamese logistics. The war effort was supported. But when the site was overrun and 12 Americans died, the government couldn't publicly acknowledge their service. The families couldn't know the truth. The survivors couldn't tell their stories. For 18 years, the mission remained classified. For 42 years, Richard Etchberger's true actions remained officially unrecognized. This pattern created moral complexity that affected families for decades. Catherine Etchberger knew her husband had been on a dangerous classified mission, but she couldn't tell her sons the truth. They grew up believing their father died in a helicopter accident. Random chance, bad luck, no heroism, no sacrifice, just an accident. When the truth came out in 1986, when the Lima Site 85 mission was declassified, the family learned that Richard had died saving 7 men, that he had fought for 6 hours against overwhelming odds, that he had been recommended for the Medal of Honor, that political considerations had prevented the award. The anger and pride were complicated. Pride in what their father had done, anger that the truth had been hidden for so long, understanding that classification had been necessary during the war, frustration that recognition had been delayed decades. When the Medal of Honor was finally awarded in 2010, it was a moment of closure that came too late. Catherine Etchberger had died in 1995, never seeing her husband receive the recognition he deserved. The three sons received the medal on their parents' behalf, representing both the father who earned it and the mother who kept the secret for 18 years. The ceremony honoured Richard Etchberger, but it also honoured every family member who lived with classified truths they couldn't share, every widow who knew more than she could say, every child who grew up without the full story of how their parent died. The declassification of the Lima Site 85 and the eventual Medal of Honor award also highlighted the Hmong contribution to the secret war in Laos. Approximately 1,000 Hmong fighters defended Pho Pha Thi, engaging North Vietnamese forces on the slopes and in the valleys, while the American technicians operated the radar. At least 30 Hmong were killed in the battle for the mountain. Thousands more Hmong fought throughout Laos under CIA direction, taking casualties that dwarfed American losses. After the American withdrawal from Southeast Asia, after the fall of Saigon in 1975, the Hmong who had fought alongside Americans faced retribution from communist forces. Many fled to refugee camps in Thailand. Many eventually resettled in the United States. The Hmong veterans of the secret war received no American military decorations, no recognition from the US government. They were irregular forces, not American personnel, but they bled the same, died the same, and when Lima Site 85 fell, died defending American personnel and American equipment. The story of Richard Etchberger is incomplete without acknowledging the Hmong who fought and died on Pho Pha Thi. The full truth of the secret war in Laos includes their sacrifice. The tactical lessons of Lima Site 85 influenced military planning for decades. The vulnerability of fixed installations to ground assault, the importance of defending multiple approaches, including supposedly impossible ones, the need for adequate security forces at forward positions, the value of personnel who can adapt to unexpected combat roles. Richard Etchberger was a radar technician who became an infantry fighter, air controller, and tactical leader because the situation demanded it. Modern military training emphasizes this kind of adaptability. Every airman receives basic combat training. Every soldier learns multiple skills. The rigid specialization that characterized earlier eras has given way to recognition that combat situations are unpredictable. The radar technician might need to fight. The pilot might need to survive on the ground. The administrator might need to direct airstrikes. Etchberger's actions at Lima Site 85 demonstrated this principle years before it became formal doctrine. The technological lessons were equally significant. The TSQ-81 radar system that guided bombing missions from Lima Site 85 was a predecessor to modern precision guidance systems. The concept of ground-based radar providing targeting data to aircraft attacking beyond visual range evolved into the modern network-centric warfare systems that dominate current operations. The bombs that struck North Vietnamese targets through monsoon clouds in 1968, guided by Etchberger's radar, were ancestors of today's GPS-guided munitions and laser-guided bombs. The line from Lima Site 85 to modern precision strike capability is direct and clear. The memorial to Lima Site 85 and its defenders took many forms. In Hamburg, Pennsylvania, Richard Etchberger's hometown, a portion of Interstate 78 in Berks County was designated the Chief Master Sergeant Richard L. Etchberger Memorial Highway. In 2018, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, the Air Force unveiled a monument at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, dedicated to the 12 airmen who died at Lima Site 85. Their names are inscribed in stone, finally receiving public recognition for their sacrifice. At Arlington National Cemetery, a memorial service is held annually on March 11th for the Lima Site 85 fallen. Survivors gather with family members to remember the battle and honour the dead. The ceremony is small and quiet, attended by those who know the story and want to ensure it's never forgotten. In Laos, on Pho Pha Thi Mountain, the remains of 9 Americans still lie where they fell in 1968. Multiple recovery missions have been conducted over the decades. partial remains of 2 men, Technical Sergeant Patrick Shannon and Lieutenant Colonel Clarence Blanton, were recovered and returned to their families. But 9 others remain on the mountain, their final resting place in territory that is difficult to access and search. The recovery effort continues. The Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency conducts periodic missions to Southeast Asia, searching for remains of Americans lost in the war. Phu Pha Thi is on their list. Someday, perhaps, the 9 men still on that mountain will come home. The stories of Medal of Honor recipients often follow predictable patterns. Combat soldiers performing extraordinary feats in their trained specialty, infantry leaders rallying their units, fighter pilots engaging against impossible odds, warriors doing warrior things. Richard Etchberger's story breaks that pattern. He was a technician thrust into combat, a specialist forced to become a generalist, a supervisor who became a frontline fighter. He didn't have the training, didn't have the experience, didn't have the tactical knowledge that should have been necessary. What he had was determination, understanding of the mission, willingness to do whatever was necessary to get his people out, and 6 hours to make it happen. The transformation from radar superintendent to defensive fighter to air controller to rescue coordinator happened in minutes. There was no time to learn, no opportunity to train, no chance to prepare, just the moment, the requirement, and the decision. When the North Vietnamese came over the cliff, Richard Etchberger decided he would stop them. When the wounded needed defending, he would defend them. When airstrikes needed directing, he would direct them. When rescue slings needed securing, he would secure them. The job changed. The requirements expanded, the mission evolved, and the man adapted. This adaptability, this refusal to be limited by job description or training background, is what makes Etchberger's story resonate beyond military circles. Most people aren't warriors. Most people are technicians, administrators, specialists in fields that don't involve combat. But situations arise that demand more than the job description requires. Emergencies that force people to step outside their expertise. Moments when someone has to do something, and you're the someone available. Richard Etchberger was a radar technician who found himself in a ground combat situation that shouldn't have happened. But it did happen, and he dealt with it. For 6 hours, on a ledge in Laos, he was exactly what the situation required, exactly when it was required. The fact that his job description said radar superintendent became irrelevant when enemy soldiers appeared. The mission became survival and rescue, and he executed that mission with the same competence he brought to maintaining electronic equipment. The human cost of the secret war in Laos extended beyond the battlefield. The families who lived with classified information they couldn't share. The children who grew up without full knowledge of how their parents served. The veterans who couldn't tell their stories even to their closest friends. The bureaucrats who maintained secrecy long after the diplomatic reasons had faded. Richard Etchberger's family spent 42 years with an incomplete story. They knew he died in Southeast Asia. They knew it involved a classified mission. But the details, the heroism, the sacrifice, remained hidden behind classification barriers that seemed increasingly pointless as years passed. The emotional toll was real and lasting. Pride in service mixed with frustration at secrecy. Knowledge that their husband and father had been important mixed with inability to explain why. The empty chair at the dinner table represented both loss and questions that couldn't be answered. When the truth finally emerged, when the full story could be told, it provided closure but couldn't replace the decades of partial knowledge. The Medal of Honor ceremony in 2010 honoured Richard Etchberger, but it also acknowledged the sacrifice of families who live with classification, secrecy, and incomplete information. The comparison between Richard Etchberger and other Medal of Honor recipients reveals interesting patterns. Many recipients performed their heroic actions over minutes or hours. Etchberger maintained his defense for 6 hours. Many recipients were combat specialists performing extraordinary versions of their trained mission. Etchberger was performing missions far outside his training. Many recipients had extensive combat experience before their Medal of Honor action. Etchberger had almost no combat experience. What he had was character, determination, and unwillingness to abandon his people. The Medal of Honor isn't awarded for competence, it's awarded for valor, for actions so far beyond normal expectations that they stand apart even from the elevated standards of military service. Richard Etchberger's actions on March 11, 1968, met that standard, a radar technician who fought like an infantryman. directed airstrikes like a forward air controller, organized rescue like a tactical commander, and died ensuring every other American got out alive. The citation uses formal language about conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity. The reality was a man with an M16 and a radio refusing to let enemy soldiers kill his wounded comrades for 6 hours under impossible conditions until rescue was complete. The tactical details of those 6 hours deserve attention. Etchberger's defensive position on the ledge was terrible by conventional standards. No cover from above, limited fields of fire, restricted movement, escape routes non-existent. But he used what he had. The ledge itself provided some protection from direct fire. The cliff below prevented approach from that direction. The only access was from above, creating a narrow killing zone where enemy soldiers had to expose themselves. Etchberger positioned himself where he could engage that killing zone while using rock outcroppings for what limited cover existed. His ammunition management was critical. An M16 magazine holds 20 or 30 rounds depending on variant. Each magazine empties in seconds on full automatic. Etchberger had to maintain fire for 6 hours. This required fire discipline that's normally taught in advanced infantry training. Single shots or short bursts, aimed fire at identified targets, conservation of ammunition while maintaining suppressive effect. A radar technician doing this intuitively, without formal training, through 6 hours of continuous combat. The air control function was equally impressive. Directing aircraft onto target requires knowing friendly positions, enemy positions, and safe engagement parameters. Requires communicating clearly while under fire. Requires understanding aircraft capabilities and weapons effects. Forward air controllers receive extensive training in these skills. Etchberger improvised, using his radio and his observations to talk A-1 Sky Raiders onto North Vietnamese positions meters from his location. The rescue coordination demonstrated leadership under pressure. Helicopter extraction using jungle penetrators is complex even in training. In combat, with enemy fire, with wounded who can't assist themselves, it becomes exponentially harder. Etchberger had to assess casualty priorities, determine who needed evacuation first, secure each man in rescue slings while exposed to enemy fire, coordinate with helicopter crews, maintain defensive fire between lifts, and do all of this while knowing that he would be last out, that he would spend the longest time exposed to enemy soldiers who were getting closer. The psychological pressure was enormous. Every minute, every second increased the probability of death. Standard human response would be to rush the process, get out as fast as possible, minimize exposure time. Instead, Etchberger methodically secured each wounded man, checked the slings, ensured everyone was fastened correctly, took the time to do it right even though every extra second increased his danger. This calm under pressure, this refusal to be rushed even when death was inevitable if rescue failed, characterized everything he did that morning. The final irony is that Richard Etchberger survived 6 hours of close combat without being wounded, only to die from a random shot in the last seconds of successful rescue. The bullet that killed him wasn't aimed, wasn't part of a directed attack, was just one round among thousands fired by enemy soldiers shooting at a helicopter. Pure chance, bad luck, the kind of death that defies narrative sense because there's no dramatic climax, no final stand, no last heroic act. Just a bullet finding a man at the worst possible moment. The crew members who pulled Etchberger into the helicopter tried to save him, applied pressure to the wound, started IVs, did everything combat medics do, but the bullet had done too much damage. He died during the flight to Long Tieng, surrounded by the men he had saved, in a helicopter that was escaping from an enemy-held mountain because he had made that escape possible. If there's symbolism in that death, it's that Richard Etchberger died as he lived on Lima Site 85, focused on the mission while being last to safety. The helicopter was escaping because he had held the position. The wounded were secured because he had put them in slings first. The rescue was successful because he had stayed last. That the mission succeeded at cost of his life was the kind of trade that military leaders make, the kind of sacrifice that Medal of Honor recipients accept. He saved 7 men. The cost was 1. The math is clear. The human loss is incalculable. The survivors of Lima Site 85 carried forward with their lives, but they never forgot the ledge in Laos and the man who kept them alive. They returned to the United States, resumed their Air Force careers or transitioned to civilian life, married, raised families, built careers. But March 11th, 1968 remained with them. The memory of enemy fire, the explosions, the wounded screaming, the sound of helicopter rotors, and Richard Etchberger methodically fitting them into rescue slings while bullets impacted around him. For 42 years they couldn't tell anyone. The mission was classified. The battle was secret. The heroism was hidden behind walls of official secrecy. They carried the knowledge alone, knowing that the greatest act of courage they had witnessed would never be publicly acknowledged. When the declassification came, when they could finally tell the story, many of them spoke to historians and journalists. Their accounts were consistent. Etchberger saved them. Without him, they would have died on that ledge. The enemy was too close, the position too vulnerable, the situation too desperate. One man made the difference between total annihilation and successful rescue. And that one man was a radar technician who wasn't supposed to know how to fight. The technical nature of Etchberger's regular assignment makes his combat performance even more remarkable. Radar maintenance requires precision, patience, and systematic troubleshooting, diagnosing electronic problems, replacing components, calibrating systems, following technical manuals. Combat requires instant decision-making, aggressive action, and adaptation to chaos. The skill sets are nearly opposite. Etchberger synthesized them. Used the systematic approach of a technician to analyze the tactical situation. Used the precision of an electronic specialist to direct airstrikes. Used the patience of a maintenance supervisor to carefully secure wounded men in rescue slings. Combined the aggressive mindset of a warrior with the careful methodology of an engineer. The result was combat effectiveness that matched or exceeded formally trained infantry. The M16 rifle that Etchberger used was itself a controversial weapon in 1968. Early versions had suffered catastrophic reliability problems, jamming in combat and failing at critical moments. The M16A1 variant that Etchberger would have carried incorporated fixes that improved reliability, chrome-plated chambers, redesigned buffer systems, improved cleaning procedures. But the weapon still required proper maintenance and knowledgeable operation. A radar technician would have understood maintenance, would have understood the importance of keeping the weapon clean and lubricated, would have approached the M16 as another system requiring proper care. That technical mindset, applying electronics troubleshooting logic to infantry weapons, may have contributed to his success. The weapon worked because he maintained it properly, fired when needed because he had ensured it was ready. The emergency radio that connected Etchberger to rescue forces was a simple device by modern standards. Limited range, basic functionality. But Etchberger knew radios, knew frequencies and transmission procedures, knew how to maximize weak signal strength, knew how to communicate clearly under pressure. The radio became his lifeline, connecting the isolated ledge to the American air assets that could provide support and rescue. Without that radio, without Etchberger's knowledge of how to use it effectively, the survivors on the ledge would have been invisible to rescue forces. The helicopters would have had no way to locate them. The attack aircraft would have had no way to distinguish American positions from enemy. The radio, in Etchberger's hands, became as important as his M16. The weapons he used that morning, the M16 rifle and the emergency radio, were simple tools. The effectiveness came from the man using them, from determination that wouldn't quit, from refusal to accept defeat, from focus on mission rather than personal survival. These qualities aren't issued with weapons or taught in technical schools, they're characteristics of the individual. Richard Etchberger brought these qualities to Lima Site 85. When the situation required combat rather than radar maintenance, he applied the same qualities to a new mission. The job changed, the man remained constant. The result was 6 hours of heroism that saved 7 lives and earned the Medal of Honor 42 years later. The physical demands of that 6-hour defense are worth considering. Maintaining any stressful activity for 6 hours is exhausting. Maintaining combat intensity where relaxation means death for 6 hours is nearly impossible. Add the altitude, over 5,000 feet, where oxygen is thinner and exertion harder. Add the wounds the other survivors suffered, requiring Etchberger to move wounded men and provide aid while fighting. Add the weight of the M16, the ammunition, the radio, the equipment. Add the adrenaline surge and crash, the fear and stress, the knowledge that rescue was uncertain and death was probable. 6 hours of this, from 0300 hours to 100 hours, through darkness and dawn, without relief, without reinforcement, without any guarantee that help would arrive in time. The physical toll would have been enormous, the mental toll worse. Yet Etchberger maintained his effectiveness from the first shots to the last sling, never degrading, never slowing, never giving up. Human endurance studies show that performance degrades under sustained stress, reaction times slow, decision-making becomes impaired, fine motor skills deteriorate. This degradation is why combat units rotate positions, why sentries are relieved regularly, why no one is expected to maintain peak performance indefinitely. Richard Etchberger maintained peak performance for 6 hours, shot accurately enough to keep enemy soldiers at bay, communicated clearly enough to direct airstrikes, worked carefully enough to properly secure wounded in rescue slings. If there was performance degradation from fatigue, stress, or fear, it wasn't apparent to the survivors who watched him work. The lesson isn't that Etchberger was superhuman, it's that he was human, facing human limitations and choosing to push through them because the mission required it. The muscle fatigue that made his arm shake, the mental exhaustion that made thinking difficult, the fear that made his hands tremble, all present, all affecting him, but insufficient to stop him. The body wants to quit under that stress. The mind looks for excuses to rest. The survival instinct says to hide, to escape, to prioritize self-preservation. Etchberger overrode these instincts through will, decided that fatigue was irrelevant, that fear was irrelevant, that personal survival was secondary to getting 7 wounded men off that mountain. For 6 hours he maintained that decision. When his body wanted rest, he kept firing. When his mind wanted escape, he kept coordinating. When survival instinct said run, he stayed. This exercise of will, this subordination of natural human responses to mission requirements is what valor means. Not absence of fear or superhuman endurance, but choice to continue despite fear, despite exhaustion, despite every human instinct saying stop. The awards and recognition that Richard Etchberger received tell only part of the story. The Air Force Cross in 1969 presented secretly. The Medal of Honor in 2010 presented publicly. These are symbols, official acknowledgement of extraordinary service, but they're not why Etchberger stayed on that ledge for 6 hours. They're not what motivated him to secure 7 wounded men before thinking of himself. He stayed because they were his men, his responsibility, his crew. Leaders don't leave people behind. Good men don't abandon wounded comrades. These weren't abstract principles to Etchberger. They were absolutes, non-negotiable truths that defined his actions regardless of personal cost. The medals recognized this, but the motivation came from within, from character and values that existed before the battle and would have existed regardless of whether anyone ever knew what happened on Pho Pha Thi. The true measure of a man, the old saying goes, is what he does when no one is watching. On a mountaintop in Laos, with his entire crew dead or wounded, Richard Etchberger could have done anything. Could have tried to escape, could have hidden, could have surrendered. No one would have blamed him. The situation was impossible, the odds insurmountable, the mission lost. If he had made any of these choices, if he had prioritized survival over duty, the 7 other Americans on that ledge would have died, and no one would ever have known that another choice was possible. But Etchberger made a different choice, stayed, fought, saved them, and in doing so demonstrated that character is revealed in crisis, that ordinary people can perform extraordinary acts when circumstances demand it, that a radar technician from Pennsylvania can become a warrior when his people need him. The story of Richard Etchberger and Lima Site 85 ends in the White House in 2010, with 3 sons receiving a medal their father earned 4 decades earlier. But it doesn't end with grief or tragedy. It ends with recognition that good men exist, that heroism is real, that sacrifice means something. Richard Etchberger spent his career maintaining radar equipment, spent his last 6 hours maintaining the lives of 7 men who depended on him. The job changed. The commitment remained constant, and when the last helicopter lifted off from Pho Pha Thi, carrying wounded survivors to safety, it carried the legacy of a man who refused to quit, who refused to abandon his people, who gave everything to ensure they went home. The radar on Lima Site 85 was destroyed, the equipment wrecked, the mission ended. But 7 men survived because one technician decided that impossible didn't mean inevitable, that overwhelming odds didn't mean certain defeat, that being outnumbered, outgunned and surrounded just meant you had to fight harder. For 6 hours on a ledge in Laos, Richard Etchberger proved that courage isn't about training or experience. It's about choices. And when the choice is between giving up or standing, between running or staying, between self-preservation or sacrifice, good men choose to stand. They choose to stay. They choose sacrifice. Richard Etchberger made those choices on March 11, 1968. 7 men came home because he did. The radar technician from Pennsylvania became a warrior. The secret mission became a Medal of Honor story. And the family that waited 42 years finally learned the truth. Their husband and father died a hero, saving his men, doing his duty, living his values in the final moments of his life. That's the story of Chief Master Sergeant Richard L. Etchberger, the man who held off an army, the radar technician who refused to quit, the warrior who was made, not born, in 6 hours on a mountaintop in Laos. His name is inscribed in stone at Maxwell Air Force Base. His medal rests with his family. His memory lives with the 7 men he saved. And his example reminds us that when the situation demands heroes, sometimes heroes appear from the most unexpected places. Sometimes they're radar technicians. Sometimes they fight for 6 hours with weapons they barely knew how to use. Sometimes they save 7 lives before thinking of their own. Sometimes they die in the last seconds of successful rescue. Always they make the choice to be more than the situation requires, to do more than duty demands, to give everything so others can go home. Richard Etchberger made that choice. 7 families have husbands, fathers and grandfathers because he did. 42 years passed before the truth came out. 42 years before the Medal of Honor was awarded. But the truth was always there, on that ledge, in those 6 hours, in the actions of one good man when it mattered most. The sky above Lima Site 85 belongs to history now. The radar is silent. The mountain is quiet. But the story of what happened there, of who Richard Etchberger was and what he did, that story lives. And as long as it's told, as long as people remember, his sacrifice means something. His choice matters. His heroism inspires. And 7 families can say, with absolute certainty, that one man made all the difference. That man was Chief Master Sergeant Richard L. Etchberger, radar technician, warrior, hero.